Betrayal does not always arrive with the loud, dramatic slam of a heavy door. Sometimes it pulls up quietly in a gleaming black sport utility vehicle, masquerading as a final act of salvation. The heavy, expensive tires of Harrison Pendleton's luxury vehicle crunched over the neglected gravel of a forgotten highway in Oak Haven County, Kentucky. Inside the climate-controlled cabin, the air was 68 degrees Fahrenheit and thick with a polished, suffocating silence. Harrison, the eldest son, wore an immaculate charcoal suit that cost more than his father made in an entire season of framing houses. His hands rested lightly on the stitched leather steering wheel, his mind perpetually calculating profit margins, property interest rates, and the undeniable, frustrating inconvenience of aging parents. In the cramped back seat sat Arthur and Eleanor Pendleton. Arthur, 76 years old, stared out the tinted window with deep-set eyes that had measured, cut, and built shelter for half a century. His hands rested on his faded denim thighs, thick, scarred blocks of muscle, permanently stained by decades of sawdust, motor oil, and industrial wood glue. The index finger on his right hand jutted out at a sharp, unnatural angle, permanently shattered during a brutal winter roofing job in 1981 because he simply could not afford a hospital visit. He never complained. Beside him, 73-year-old Eleanor sat perfectly straight. She had spent 35 years teaching elementary school mathematics, wiping chalk dust from her modest skirts, and effortlessly deciphering the hidden sorrows of children. Her posture was a quiet, unyielding masterclass in human pride. She did not weep and she did not beg. She merely watched the back of her son's perfectly groomed head, reading the stiff tension in his shoulders, the deliberate way he avoided the rearview mirror. "It is just a temporary arrangement until the estate is completely settled," Harrison said smoothly, his tone practiced, hollow, and utterly devoid of any genuine warmth. "A clean, quiet facility to rest and get your bearings." But the vehicle did not stop at a manicured retirement community with rolling green lawns. It idled aggressively in front of a decaying roadside motel, its shattered neon sign flickering and buzzing like a dying insect. The paint peeled from the exterior doors in long, sickly, sun-bleached strips. Harrison popped the trunk, stepped out onto the cracked asphalt, and unceremoniously dropped 2 battered canvas suitcases onto the dirt. He did not look his father in the eye. He did not offer his mother a comforting embrace. He simply checked his heavy gold watch, muttered a breathless excuse about an urgent commercial zoning meeting back in the city, and climbed back into the driver's seat. The engine roared. He was gone. The red taillights vanished into the thick, dusty Kentucky haze, leaving behind nothing but the acrid stench of exhaust and the heavy, crushing weight of absolute abandonment. Arthur and Eleanor stood completely still on the side of the desolate road. 42 years of marriage, 42 years of backbreaking labor on swaying wooden scaffolds, and 35 years of patient, underpaid teaching had culminated in this exact, humiliating moment. They had mortgaged the very home Arthur built with his own 2 hands, signing away their peaceful twilight years to fund the prestigious university education that ultimately turned their own flesh and blood into a ruthless, cold-blooded stranger. Arthur slowly reached down and picked up the bags. They weighed perhaps 40 pounds each, holding the absolute entirety of their accumulated existence. He walked toward the motel office, his heavy leather work boots dragging slightly across the loose gravel. The air outside was a suffocating 95 degrees Fahrenheit, thick with oppressive humidity and the faint, sour smell of stale beer. Inside the cramped, dimly lit office, a bored clerk wordlessly handed over a brass key attached to a cheap plastic tag. Eleanor opened her worn leather purse to pay for the first night. She extracted a small, tightly folded wad of paper money. After handing over the exorbitant fee for a room that promised nothing but mildew and despair, she quietly counted what was left. $220. That was the absolute sum of their worth in the eyes of a cruel world. $220 to stretch across the unpredictable remainder of their natural lives. They walked side by side down the exterior concrete corridor, passing doors with kicked-in panels and windows hastily patched with cardboard. Room number 12. Arthur turned the rusted key. The heavy wooden door scraped loudly against the uneven, peeling linoleum floor. The room was perhaps 12 feet by 15, a suffocating little box of faded floral wallpaper, a sagging twin mattress, and a single flickering bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling. Eleanor walked to the small bathroom sink, turned the rusted metal faucet, and wet a thin, scratchy washcloth. She returned to her husband, gently lifting his massive, ruined hands. Carefully, meticulously, she wiped the dark highway dust from his knuckles, her fingers lingering affectionately on the broken finger from 1981. They did not speak of the son who had so casually discarded them. They did not curse the heavens, nor did they shed a single tear of self-pity. Tears were an exuberant luxury they could no longer afford. Arthur sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the rusted metal springs groaning loudly in protest. He looked at the thin, water-damaged walls, his seasoned carpenter's mind automatically calculating the cheap drywall, the shoddy 2x4 wooden studs, the sheer, dangerous lack of structural integrity. A house built on greed and shortcuts would eventually collapse. He knew that better than anyone alive. But for now, this crumbling, pathetic box was their entire universe. As the late afternoon shadows stretched long and dark across the stained carpet, Eleanor sat quietly by the single dirt-streaked window. She held the flimsy motel receipt in her lap, smoothing the torn edges with her thumb. The terrifying reality of their situation pressed down on them like a physical weight. The $220 would vanish in a matter of mere days. Food, drinking water, another night in this dreadful place. It was an impossible, brutal arithmetic that offered no salvation. She looked over at Arthur, his gray head bowed in silent, stoic thought, and wondered, with a quiet, creeping dread, if 42 years of blood, sweat, and boundless sacrifice were truly meant to end in a slow, forgotten death inside a decaying roadside motel room. She reached into her purse to put the receipt away, her fingers brushing against a folded piece of coarse paper. It was a flyer she had unknowingly picked up off the sticky counter at the motel office, printed on cheap yellow stock by the Oak Haven County Municipal Board. She unfolded it, her tired eyes scanning the mundane public notices, the residential zoning changes, the bleak tax foreclosures. Her gaze abruptly stopped at the bottom corner, locking onto a bizarre, almost insulting string of words regarding a condemned county property. The $220 evaporated with terrifying speed. It bled away on overpriced nights in the squalid motel room, on stale loaves of cheap white bread, on thin slices of processed meat, and on tiny bottles of purified water, a slow, agonizing drain of their final resources. Within 2 weeks, they were completely destitute. They walked 3 miles down the gravel shoulder of the highway, dragging their heavy suitcases behind them. The scorching summer sun beat down relentlessly on their aching backs, heating the cracked asphalt to well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They found temporary, humiliating refuge inside the drafty fellowship hall of the Oak Haven First Baptist Church. They slept on cold metal folding chairs pushed awkwardly together in the dark, using their winter coats as makeshift blankets against the bitter nighttime chill. In Arthur's worn leather wallet, the entire remaining sum of their existence had dwindled to exactly $11. $11. Eleanor did not weep in the dark shadows of the church hall. She did not curse the heavens, nor did she waste a single breath hating the son who had abandoned them to rot in the forgotten corners of the county. Instead, she smoothed her wrinkled skirt, walked past the sympathetic, pitying gazes of the young church volunteers, and headed straight toward the Oak Haven County Municipal Records Office. She remembered the strange string of text on that cheap yellow paper from the motel. The clerk at the front desk looked at her with polite condescension. Eleanor requested the property file with a calm, unwavering voice. The file revealed a massive, decaying concrete structure sitting on 2 acres of barren, rocky land at the absolute edge of the county limits. It was an abandoned minimum security county jail built in the early 1990s and abruptly shuttered a decade later due to severe state budget cuts. It was considered a toxic, unsellable liability, completely overgrown with invasive weeds, stripped of all valuable copper wiring, and totally forgotten by the modern world. The local government was desperate to unload the ruined property just to avoid paying the yearly maintenance liability. The listed purchase price was exactly $6. $6! It was a number so absurdly low it felt like a cruel, deliberate insult from the universe. Eleanor carried the thick paper documents back to the church hall, carefully spreading the faded blueprints and legal forms across a plastic folding table. Arthur looked at the faded blue ink, his calloused thumb slowly tracing the thick lines denoting load-bearing walls, reinforced steel foundations, and massive limestone blocks. "We need a place to stand," Arthur said quietly. Arthur walked to the county office with Eleanor by his side. The young, impeccably dressed clerks snickered behind their sleek computer monitors, whispering cruel jokes about the crazy old vagrants buying a useless pile of rubble. They practically radiated smug, comfortable arrogance in their expensive suits. Arthur ignored them completely. He reached into his faded denim pocket and placed his scarred, broken hands flat on the polished mahogany counter. He slowly, methodically counted out 6 crumpled $1 bills. He pushed the money across the smooth desk. The clerk stamped the official deed with a loud, final thud, handing over a heavy iron key that looked more like an antique weapon than a tool for modern salvation. They were legally home. The local pastor, a kindly man, burdened by too many community obligations and too little faith in sudden miracles, offered to drive them out to the desolate site. The old pickup truck bumped along a deeply rutted dirt road for 5 miles, leaving civilization far behind in a thick cloud of choking red dust. When the vehicle finally stopped, the engine sputtering into silence, the pastor looked out at the massive, looming ruin with deep, genuine sorrow. He saw a terrifying graveyard of shattered concrete and rusted steel. He saw a horrific, hopeless tomb for 2 desperate elders. "I can take you back to town," the pastor offered gently, his voice thick with concern. "No," Eleanor replied softly. They stepped out of the truck, taking their 2 heavy canvas suitcases. The pastor slowly drove away, his red taillights disappearing over the distant rocky ridge, leaving them completely alone in the creeping twilight. The air was dead, heavy, and eerily silent. Arthur walked toward the massive front entrance. The massive iron door hung slightly off its reinforced steel hinges, groaning a deep, mournful sound as the evening wind pushed against it. It was a terrifying, imposing fortress of decay, a brutal monument to forgotten mistakes and discarded lives. Arthur placed his thick palms against the cold, rusted metal. He pushed. The heavy door shrieked in protest, scraping loudly against the cracked concrete floor, slowly revealing the pitch-black abyss of the main cell block. He stepped cautiously into the darkness, inhaling the sharp, overwhelming stench of mildew, stagnant water, and decades of absolute abandonment. He stood completely still, his eyes adjusting to the thin shafts of dying sunlight piercing through the shattered security windows. He had walked into what the entire world believed was his final pathetic resting place. But then his gaze suddenly stopped. The interior of the abandoned county jail was a sprawling, horrific cavern of absolute desolation. Shattered glass from dozens of reinforced security windows blanketed the cracked concrete floor, glittering like jagged teeth in the fading twilight. Thick, suffocating webs of dust hung from the exposed steel ceiling joists, dropping like ancient shrouds across the rusted iron cell bars. The air was heavily stagnant, a foul, suffocating mixture of dried rat droppings, rotting wood, and the unmistakable lingering dampness of 50 years of utter neglect. Every step they took echoed loudly down the long, hollow corridor. It was a graveyard of broken things. Arthur walked slowly down the center aisle, his heavy boots crushing the debris into a fine white powder. Any ordinary man, any soft-handed executive accustomed to the 72-degree Fahrenheit comfort of a modern corporate office would have fallen to his knees in total despair. They would have seen only an impossible, toxic nightmare. Arthur did not see a nightmare. He stopped in the middle of a massive cell block, closing his eyes and listening to the deep, structural silence of the building. His massive, scarred hands that had framed hundreds of residential roofs and driven thousands of 3-inch steel nails into stubborn oak beams, reached out to touch the cold, imposing walls. He ran his calloused, broken index finger along the thick mortar joints. He scraped away a layer of black grime. Beneath the superficial rot, the underlying skeleton was a masterclass in forgotten craftsmanship. The primary structural columns were solid, poured concrete, reinforced with half-inch steel rebar that had not yielded a single fraction of an inch to the relentless passage of time. The foundation was constructed from massive, interlocking blocks of Kentucky limestone, stacked 3 feet thick and buried deep into the unforgiving earth. The roof decking, though stripped of its protective shingles, was supported by heavy, old-growth timber trusses that were entirely free of severe water damage or devastating termite rot. The building was not dying. It was merely sleeping. "It is completely dry," Arthur murmured quietly, his deep voice resonating against the heavy stone walls. He turned to his wife. Eleanor stood near the entrance of what had once been a maximum security holding cell, measuring roughly 10 feet by 8 feet. She did not express horror at the rusted toilet bolted to the back wall, nor did she flinch at the thick iron bars that formed the front barrier. She possessed a terrifying, unyielding strength that 35 years of managing chaotic classrooms had forged into solid steel. Night fell rapidly, plunging the colossal structure into absolute darkness. The temperature inside the thick stone walls plummeted to a chilling 45 degrees Fahrenheit, a stark and brutal contrast to the blistering afternoon heat. They had no electricity, they had no running water. Arthur cleared a small, relatively clean section of the concrete floor inside the open cell, using the side of his heavy leather boot. He laid down their thin winter coats, creating a pathetic, meager barrier against the freezing cement. They sat silently in the oppressive darkness, eating the very last dry crusts of their cheap white bread. Eleanor reached for her heavy canvas suitcase. She laid it flat on the hard floor and unzipped the main compartment. Her fingers found the edge of the maroon fabric lining, a cheap piece of synthetic silk that once held her modest collection of church dresses. She gripped the fabric tightly. She pulled with a sharp, violent motion. The fabric tore away from the suitcase with a loud ripping sound that echoed sharply through the empty cell block. She stood up in the darkness, feeling her way along the cold iron bars of the cell door. With precise, deliberate movements, she wove the long strip of dark maroon fabric through the rigid steel vertical posts, tying tight, secure knots at the far ends. It was a simple, desperate act, yet as the weak moonlight filtered through the shattered exterior windows and caught the dull sheen of the maroon fabric, the brutal, terrifying prison cell instantly transformed. The cold iron bars vanished behind the soft, draped cloth. It was no longer a cage, it was a room. Eleanor sat back down beside her husband, resting her tired head against his broad, solid shoulder. They did not speak of the son who had condemned them to this cold stone tomb. They did not mourn the warm, comfortable house they had sacrificed for his ruthless ambition. They simply closed their eyes, letting the heavy, absolute silence of the fortress wash over them. Morning arrived with a piercing shaft of bright golden sunlight cutting directly across the dusty concrete floor. Arthur woke before dawn, his stiff, aging muscles screaming in silent agony from the freezing night on the unyielding floor. He stood up, stretching his back, his mind already automatically calculating the immense back-breaking labor required to bring this stone giant back to life. He reached into his worn denim pocket. He pulled out 5 crumpled $1 bills. It was the absolute entirety of their wealth. Arthur knew the limestone frame was a structural masterpiece, a fortress built to withstand the wrath of centuries, but as he stared at the pitiful, wrinkled paper money in his scarred palm, how could an old, discarded carpenter possibly revive a massive, rotting fortress with just his bare hands and 5 single dollars? Arthur did not waste a single moment mourning the impossibility of their bleak situation. He did not sit on the cold floor and lament the cruel, unforgiving nature of a son who measured human life entirely by profit margins and luxury vehicles. Instead, he stood up, buttoned his faded flannel shirt against the morning chill, and walked past the main cell blocks. He pushed his heavy shoulders against a warped wooden door leading to the collapsed exterior maintenance shed. The air inside the ruined shed was suffocating, thick with the foul smell of rotting damp leaves and rusted iron parts. Arthur dug through massive, dangerous piles of rotted lumber, shattered safety glass, and discarded machinery parts until his calloused hands brushed against cold, heavy steel. He pulled it free from the crushing debris. It was a solid steel crowbar measuring exactly 36 inches in length and weighing nearly 15 pounds. It was coated in a thick, powdery layer of deep orange rust, but the heavy iron core was completely unbroken. He carried the heavy tool back into the main corridor, his seasoned carpenter's eyes scanning the long rows of non-structural iron partitions that had once separated the guard stations from the visitors' waiting areas. These were thick, vertical iron bars bolted directly into the concrete floor, entirely useless for holding up the massive limestone roof. He wedged the flattened, rusted tip of the heavy crowbar under the thick baseplate of the first iron rod. He planted his heavy leather work boots firmly against the dusty concrete floor, took a slow, deep breath, and threw the entire weight of his solid 76-year-old frame against the rigid steel lever. The metal shrieked. The rusted retaining bolts snapped with a sharp, violent crack that echoed down the long, empty stone hallway like a sudden gunshot. Arthur pulled the heavy iron bar free, dragging it to the center aisle. He moved immediately to the next one, his ruined hands gripping the rough steel, his permanently shattered index finger resting awkwardly against the heavy metal shaft.
He worked continuously for 6 grueling hours without a single drop of water. Sweat poured heavily down his weathered, deeply lined face, soaking his collar and stinging his tired eyes. But he never slowed his methodical, punishing pace. He tore down exactly 18 iron bars. Each solid metal rod weighed roughly 40 pounds, creating a massive, back-breaking pile of raw scrap iron lying on the cracked floor. He He dragged them one by one out to the gravel shoulder of the desolate highway, waiting patiently under the blistering afternoon sun until a loud, rattling local scrap metal collection truck rumbled down the road. The driver, a sweaty man chewing heavily on a piece of dried tobacco, weighed the massive pile of iron on a mechanical scale and handed over a small, folded wad of greasy paper money. $62. Arthur folded the crumpled bills carefully, placing them next to his remaining 5 single dollars, making exactly $67 to his name. He walked 2 miles down the hot asphalt road into the small, dusty town of Oakhaven, his heavy boots leaving faint gray prints in the dry dirt. The local hardware store was a dark, cramped building that smelled sharply of heavy motor oil, freshly cut pine timber, and rich chemical fertilizer. Behind the scratched glass counter stood Silas, a heavily bearded, fiercely scowling man in grease-stained denim overalls who had spent his entire life dealing with cheap contractors and local drunks. Arthur walked slowly through the narrow, crowded aisles, carefully selecting the absolute bare essentials for basic human survival. He gathered 4 lengths of half-inch plastic water pipe, a small tin of industrial sealing cement, 2 heavy boxes of 3-inch galvanized wood screws, a cheap handsaw, and a stiff bristle scrubbing brush. He carried the heavy items to the front counter. Silas looked at the pile of random supplies, his dark eyes narrowing in deep, cynical suspicion. He knew these old folks had just bought the ruined county jail, and he assumed they were just another pair of foolish, helpless city retirees who would inevitably freeze to death by the first snow of December. He started aggressively punching the prices into his heavy, mechanical cash register, the total quickly climbing well past $80. Then Silas looked down. He saw Arthur's massive hands resting quietly on the scratched glass counter. He saw the thick, permanent layers of dark sawdust embedded deep in the skin crevices, the swollen, battered knuckles, the brutal white scar stretched across the palms, and that terribly broken, unhealed index finger pointing off at a crooked angle. Silas was a rough man who understood the brutal, unforgiving language of immense physical labor. In Arthur's ruined hands, the store owner read an entire lifetime of silent, agonizing, completely honorable sacrifice. Silas stopped punching the metal keys. He looked up at Arthur's calm, unwavering gray eyes, recognizing a profound, unbreakable human dignity that commanded absolute, immediate respect. Silas slowly reached out and completely cleared the high number on the heavy mechanical register, his rough fingers deliberately punching in a new, entirely fabricated total. "That will be $15, Silas grunted quietly, refusing to make a spectacle of his charity. Arthur knew perfectly well the supplies were worth 5 times that amount, but he also understood the quiet, unspoken code of honorable working men. He did not argue, nor did he offer a pathetic, undignified display of tearful gratitude. "Thank you," Arthur replied softly, nodding his head just once. He handed over $15, carefully tucking the remaining $52 back into his faded pocket, and carried the heavy supplies out into the blazing 90-degree Fahrenheit heat. The physical transformation of the condemned stone fortress began with grueling, relentless, stoic labor. Eleanor took the heavy bristle brush and a plastic bucket of water hauled from a muddy creek half a mile away, dropping straight to her hands and knees on the freezing concrete floor. For 3 solid, agonizing days, she scrubbed away decades of dried rat feces, thick black mold, and stagnant dirt from the main cell block. Her delicate knuckles bruised a dark, painful purple, and her aging shoulders burned with intense agony. She never stopped moving. She never shed a single tear. While Eleanor relentlessly cleaned the interior, Arthur marched to the rear of the 2-acre property, where the old industrial water well sat buried under 5 feet of overgrown, painfully thorny blackberry bushes. He spent an entire afternoon hacking away the vines with his heavy hands and the handsaw, finally exposing the rusted mechanical pump. The heavy iron pistons were completely seized by decades of deep internal rust, frozen as solid as a block of granite. He took his new tools, carefully unbolting the heavy iron casing, greasing the thick metal gears with a cheap tin of lubricant, and replacing the cracked rubber seals using thin strips cut straight from his own heavy leather work belt. He reassembled the massive mechanism, gripped the heavy iron lever with both his scarred hands, and pushed down with every ounce of his remaining physical strength. The rusted steel pipes groaned loudly in the dirt. A sudden violent burst of dark brown sludge erupted from the iron spout, splashing heavily onto his work boots. Arthur kept pumping, his broad chest heaving, his muscles burning fiercely, until the dark, toxic sludge slowly turned into a steady, beautiful, roaring stream of crystal-clear, freezing cold groundwater. They had pure water. They hauled heavy buckets of clean water inside, washing the cracked floors repeatedly until the pure gray concrete finally shone brightly through the terrible darkness. The small holding cell with Eleanor's maroon fabric curtain was completely scrubbed clean, transformed from a miserable, filthy cage into a Spartan, fiercely protected bedroom. The stagnant air inside the massive limestone walls began to drastically change, losing the sour, toxic stench of absolute decay and taking on the fresh, crisp scent of clean water and honest, brutal hard work. The quiet, relentless dignity of their daily labor did not go unnoticed by the scattered rural community of Oak Haven County. Local farmers driving their heavy diesel trucks down the highway saw the elderly couple working out under the blistering sun, day after day. They noticed that these two old souls never asked for a single handout, never held up a pathetic cardboard sign begging for loose change, and simply bled into the dirt to build a dignified life. A quiet, profound respect began to ripple rapidly through the rural valley. A local dairy farmer silently pulled his truck over and dropped off a heavy 50-pound sack of raw yellow potatoes and 2 thick wool blankets at the rusted iron gate, driving away before Arthur could even walk over to say a single word. A local dairy farmer silently pulled his truck over and dropped off a heavy 50-pound sack of raw yellow potatoes and 2 thick wool blankets at the rusted iron gate, driving away before Arthur could even walk over to say a single word. A local retired county electrician, hearing the incredible rumors spreading around Silas's hardware store, drove his utility bucket truck out to the property on a quiet Sunday morning. Without asking for any permission or demanding any financial payment, he simply climbed the massive wooden utility pole, pulled a thick copper wire across the dusty gravel road, and wired the heavy main breaker box directly into the active county power grid. He flipped the heavy steel switch. The entire main corridor of the abandoned jail suddenly flooded with blinding, glorious yellow light. Decades of absolute, terrifying darkness instantly vanished, revealing the massive, sweeping scale of the brilliant stone architecture Arthur had so painstakingly uncovered. The local community had recognized their unyielding pride, and in a silent return, they had fiercely rallied around the old carpenter and the dignified schoolteacher. The fortress was glowing warmly against the dark, creeping Kentucky night, standing tall as a beacon of impossible resilience against the barren landscape. Eleanor walked quietly down the long, brightly lit corridor, carrying a warm cup of clean water, searching for her husband. She found Arthur at the far end of the cell block, working diligently under the humming fluorescent ceiling lights. Eleanor stopped perfectly still in the open doorway, her breath catching softly in her throat. She looked at the sturdy, beautiful frames taking shape under his bleeding, calloused hands, realizing with a sudden, sharp shock that Arthur was not building large, comfortable furniture for the two of them. He was painstakingly constructing wooden bed frames that were distinctly smaller, significantly lower to the cold ground, and enclosed with gentle, highly protective wooden side rails. It was as if the silent, stoic carpenter was meticulously preparing their massive stone fortress to welcome a secret that was only just about to cross their threshold.
The true treasure of the Oak Haven County Jail was never buried in the dirt, nor was it hidden behind the heavy limestone walls. Arthur Pendleton had spent 42 years framing houses for wealthy clients who cared only about square footage and property value. He knew the difference between a house and a sanctuary. The massive concrete structure they had purchased for exactly $6 possessed an architectural feature that no modern mansion could ever replicate: absolute, impenetrable security. The heavy iron doors, the reinforced steel bars, the 3-foot-thick stone foundation, they were not designed to keep people in. They were perfectly engineered to keep the cruel, violent world out. The first knock came on a freezing Tuesday night in late October. The temperature had plunged to a bitter 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and a heavy, driving rain pounded fiercely against the exterior stone walls. Arthur pushed the heavy iron door open, the rusted hinges groaning loudly into the storm. Standing on the concrete threshold was Clara. She was 19 years old, shivering violently in a thin, soaked denim jacket. She was 7 months pregnant, clutching a plastic grocery bag containing her existence. A dark purple bruise covered the left side of her jaw. She had run 3 miles down the pitch-black highway to escape a violent partner, drawn blindly toward the warm yellow light spilling from the abandoned jail. Eleanor did not ask a single invasive question. 35 years of teaching elementary school had given her the profound, silent ability to instantly read the deep, unspoken terror in a young person's eyes. She simply wrapped her own dry wool blanket around the shivering girl, led her into the small cell with the maroon fabric curtain, and handed her a warm cup of clean water. "You are safe here," Eleanor said, softly, her voice carrying the absolute, unyielding authority of a stone fortress. Clara sank onto the low wooden bed Arthur had meticulously built just days before. For the first time in years, the abused girl looked at the thick iron bars separating her room from the main corridor, and she did not see a terrifying prison. She saw a magnificent, impenetrable shield. She slept deeply. 3 days later, Elias arrived. He was a 68-year-old retired factory worker whose pension had completely collapsed. He had been sleeping inside his battered sedan in the dusty parking lot of Silas's hardware store, freezing to death as the winter winds howled. Silas had quietly pointed the proud, broken man toward the old county road. Arthur met Elias in the gravel driveway. The 2 old men looked at each other, instantly recognizing the shared, silent exhaustion of men discarded by a ruthless society. Arthur did not offer pity. He simply handed Elias a heavy steel wrench and asked for his help repairing the secondary water pipes. In exchange for honest labor, Elias was given a secure cell block at the end of the hall, a warm bed, and his dignity perfectly intact. Then came Julian. He was a 15-year-old runaway, carrying a torn canvas backpack and a fiercely defiant glare meant to hide his overwhelming terror. He had been caught stealing a cheap loaf of bread from the local market. The town sheriff, knowing the boy would be destroyed in the state juvenile system, quietly drove him out to the $6 property and dropped him off without a single word of official paperwork. Within 2 months, the barren stone tomb had fundamentally transformed. They were joined by a young, exhausted mother named Sarah and her quiet 4-year-old son, making a total of 7 patched-up, discarded souls living inside the colossal concrete walls. The massive central corridor, once filled with violent screams of desperate inmates, now echoed with the soft, gentle laughter of a small child playing on the clean gray floor. While their son, Harrison, sat in a sleek, glass-walled corporate office 100 miles away, adjusting his silk tie and evicting struggling families to maximize his commercial real estate portfolio, Arthur and Eleanor were quietly building an empire of human grace. Harrison measured success in millions of dollars and flawless credit scores. Arthur measured success by the heavy, peaceful breathing of a battered 19-year-old girl finally sleeping without fear behind a locked iron gate. The space was completely redefined. The heavy iron bars, once a brutal symbol of state punishment, became sturdy racks for drying freshly washed clothes. The towering guard station, with its bulletproof glass completely shattered, was meticulously rebuilt by Arthur into a magnificent communal dining table using salvaged pine timber and thick steel screws. They shared meager meals of roasted yellow potatoes and cheap rice, but they ate with the profound, quiet grace of royalty. Arthur taught Julian how to properly hold a wooden hammer, his permanently shattered index finger guiding the young boy's hesitant hands. Eleanor taught Sarah's little boy how to count using small, smooth white pebbles gathered from the frozen gravel driveway. The $6 had not bought a ruin, it had bought a genuine miracle. Arthur and Eleanor had been thrown away by their own flesh and blood, abandoned with just $220 to die quietly in a decaying roadside motel. Yet, through stoic labor and an unbreakable spirit, they had taken the most despised, toxic piece of real estate in Oak Haven County and turned it into an absolute paradise for the forgotten. It was a masterpiece of human resilience. The heavy winter snow began to fall, covering the 2 acres of rocky land in a pristine, brilliant white blanket. Inside the thick limestone walls, the temperature held steady at a comfortable 65 degrees Fahrenheit, warmed by a large recycled iron wood stove Arthur had installed in the center of the room. The 7 souls sat together in the golden firelight, safe, warm, and entirely at peace. They had finally found their permanent home. The morning sun rose brilliantly over the snow-covered ridge, illuminating the frost-covered iron gates of the fortress. The world was completely still, silent, and beautifully calm. Arthur walked out to the rusted metal mailbox at the end of the long gravel driveway, his heavy boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. He opened the heavy metal door. Inside lay a single crisp white envelope, completely devoid of standard postage. It bore the heavy, imposing crest of the Oak Haven County Municipal Government, stamped aggressively with bright red ink. Arthur tore open the seal with his scarred thumb, unfolding the stiff legal paper, his gray eyes scanning the terrifying absolute language of municipal building codes, unauthorized residential zoning, and immediate structural condemnation. The county was coming to tear their entire world down to the dirt.
The heavy government vehicle pulled onto the gravel driveway just after 8 o'clock in the morning. Out stepped Chief Inspector Miller, a rigid, unsmiling man who carried a heavy wooden clipboard and the absolute authority to reduce the limestone fortress to a pile of crushed rubble. He had received an anonymous, vicious tip about a dangerous, illegal squatter camp operating inside the condemned county property. He marched up to the colossal iron doors, fully prepared to forcefully evict the frail old vagrants and permanently padlock the massive steel chains. Arthur Pendleton stood waiting on the concrete threshold. He wore his faded denim jacket against the 40-degree Fahrenheit chill. He did not tremble, he did not plead for mercy, nor did he offer a single desperate excuse. He simply stepped back, his ruined, scarred hand gesturing silently for the government official to enter the building. Miller stepped out of the freezing wind and into the main corridor. He stopped dead in his tracks. The inspector had fully expected to find a toxic, terrifying labyrinth of exposed copper wires, raw sewage, and collapsing drywall. Instead, his widened eyes swept across a sweeping, immaculately clean architectural masterpiece. He saw the towering 30-foot limestone ceilings, perfectly illuminated by safely conduit-housed electrical lines. He saw the heavy ironwood stove drafting flawlessly through a newly fabricated double-walled steel chimney pipe that Arthur had meticulously welded by hand. Miller pulled a heavy metal flashlight and a steel tape measure from his thick winter coat. He spent 3 agonizingly slow hours crawling through the hidden mechanical bowels of the colossal structure. He inspected the newly sealed water lines, expecting to find cheap, dangerous shortcuts, but found tightly fitted half-inch pipes secured with heavy galvanized brackets every 2 feet. He climbed the secondary emergency exit, a massive set of exterior steel stairs that Arthur had salvaged and re-anchored deep into the 3-foot-thick, solid limestone foundation using massive masonry bolts. It was not just structurally adequate, it was a masterclass in heavy commercial engineering. "Who did the structural welding on the eastern fire escape?" Miller asked, his voice entirely stripped of its previous bureaucratic arrogance. "I did," Arthur replied calmly, his voice steady and low. Miller looked at the old carpenter, staring intensely at the permanently shattered index finger and the thick, brutal scars stretching across the 76-year-old hands. He looked around the warm, fiercely protected sanctuary, seeing young Clara gently rocking her newborn baby behind the heavy iron bars that now functioned as a beautiful, draped nursery. He saw Elias peacefully reading a worn paperback book in the bright golden light. The inspector slowly lowered his heavy wooden clipboard. He pulled a heavy black pen from his chest pocket. He did not sign the red-stamped demolition order. Instead, he flipped to a fresh, crisp white page, his hand moving rapidly as he authorized a permanent, unconditional certificate of commercial occupancy, officially legally validating the $6 fortress against all local and state building codes. The government had tried to crush them. The truth made them entirely untouchable. The astonishing verdict of the fierce county inspector leaked rapidly to the local press. Within 48 hours, a small local newspaper published a massive front-page feature detailing the impossible, miraculous revival of the toxic jailhouse. The profound, deeply human story of a stoic, discarded carpenter and a dignified schoolteacher building an impenetrable safe haven for the broken souls of Oak Haven County caught fire. A major national television broadcasting network sent a massive white satellite truck down the rutted gravel road. They filmed the heavy iron doors, the beautiful maroon fabric curtains, and the roaring, crystal-clear water pump. Eleanor stood gracefully beside her husband, wearing a simple, impeccably pressed dress, her spine perfectly straight as she spoke to the national reporters. She did not boast, and she did not ask for a single dollar of charity. She merely stated with profound, quiet grace that every human being deserved a solid roof and a heavy door to lock out the cold. They broadcast the exact astonishing purchase price of $6 to millions of viewers across the entire country, transforming the abandoned, worthless ruin into a priceless, celebrated national phenomenon of human resilience and quiet, absolute dignity. The glowing television broadcast beamed brightly through the invisible digital airwaves, crossing over 300 miles of state highways. It landed on a massive, perfectly flat glass screen mounted to the wall of a pristine, heavily air-conditioned executive office suite. Sitting behind a sprawling mahogany desk was a man in an immaculate charcoal suit. Harrison Pendleton stared intently at the high-definition image of his discarded parents standing proudly in front of a massive, legally certified, world-famous piece of prime commercial real estate.
He saw the viral fame, he saw the boundless, untapped financial potential of a fully permitted concrete structure, and he slowly leaned forward in his expensive leather chair. His dark eyes narrowed into cold, calculating slits as a twisted, greedy scheme began to violently turn inside his mind. The heavy, expensive tires of the gleaming black sport utility vehicle crunched violently against the rough gravel driveway. Harrison Pendleton had driven 300 miles across 2 state lines. Inside his climate-controlled cabin, his mind had raced continuously with aggressive corporate strategies, hostile takeover clauses, commercial property valuations, tax loophole exploitation, and the sheer, undeniable monetary value of a massive, fully permitted stone structure sitting completely unencumbered on 2 pristine acres of land. He parked the luxury vehicle directly in front of the massive iron doors. He turned off the engine. He stepped out into the crisp 50-degree Fahrenheit morning air. Harrison smoothed the lapels of his immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal suit, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the cold mud. He looked up at the towering limestone walls, but he did not see a sacred sanctuary for battered souls, a safe haven for runaway children, or a profound miracle of human endurance built from blood and sweat. He only saw dollar signs. He saw a highly marketable rural retreat, a trendy boutique hotel, a multi-million-dollar commercial asset completely devoid of any corporate oversight, just waiting to be legally extracted from 2 ignorant, helpless, elderly fools. Arthur and Eleanor Pendleton stood waiting on the elevated concrete threshold of the main entrance. Arthur held a heavy steel wrench loosely in his permanently scarred, massive right hand. His ruined index finger rested quietly against the cold metal shaft. Eleanor stood perfectly straight beside him, wrapped in a thick, modest gray cardigan. They did not rush forward to embrace the son who had abandoned them at a decaying motel. They did not cry out in shock, anger, or tragic despair. They simply watched him. Harrison flashed a brilliant, entirely hollow smile, attempting to project an aura of deep, desperate familial concern as he climbed the heavy steel stairs Arthur had welded by hand. "Mother, Father, I saw the news broadcast and I was absolutely terrified for your safety." Harrison lied smoothly, his voice dripping with practiced, manipulative warmth. "This entire property is a massive, uncontrollable liability. You have unauthorized strangers sleeping inside these walls. You are running an unlicensed boarding house, exposing yourselves to catastrophic civil lawsuits, devastating property taxes, massive insurance penalties, and imminent local prosecution." He paused, letting the heavy string of fabricated threats hang in the cold air. "I came to save you," he said gently. Harrison reached into his breast pocket of his expensive corporate suit jacket, pulling out a thick stack of crisp legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. "My corporate lawyers have drafted an emergency transfer of deed. If you sign the property over to my holding company today, I can absorb all the legal liability, handle the fierce county regulators, relocate these squatters to proper state facilities, and finally get you both into that comfortable luxury retirement community you truly deserve." "Stop," Eleanor commanded quietly. The single soft word cut through his polished corporate monologue like a razor blade slicing through cheap silk. She did not raise her voice. She did not scream. 35 years of commanding chaotic classrooms had taught her the absolute, terrifying power of complete, unyielding silence. Harrison froze. Eleanor slowly reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She did not pull out a desperate plea for affection, nor did she present the crumpled, pathetic motel receipt that once marked their ultimate doom. She pulled out a single heavy folder bearing the bright red embossed seal of the Oak Haven municipal government. She opened it, turning the crisp white pages toward her son. The first document was the unconditional certificate of commercial occupancy, signed in thick black ink by the chief inspector, legally validating every single inch of the massive limestone fortress. The second document was a verified federal registration certificate, officially establishing the 2-acre property as a protected, tax-exempt, non-profit charitable foundation. The final document was an ironclad legal trust deed. "Look at the bottom line, Harrison," Eleanor instructed coldly. Harrison stepped closer, his dark eyes scanning the dense legal text. His heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The trust explicitly stated that the entire estate, the limestone building, the 2 acres of land, and all associated assets were permanently bound to the charity. Furthermore, a specific, devastatingly clear clause permanently barred any direct blood relative of the founders from ever holding a board seat, claiming a financial stake, or exercising a single fraction of legal authority over the premises in perpetuity. They had completely, legally locked him out. "You did not come here to save us," Eleanor stated, her voice echoing off the solid stone walls with absolute, crushing dignity. "You came here because you saw a $6 ruin transformed into a priceless jewel, and your greedy, empty soul could not bear the thought of something beautiful existing without you exploiting it for a profit margin." Harrison opened his mouth to argue, to deploy his sophisticated corporate rhetoric, but his voice completely failed him. "We survived your betrayal with $220 and our bare hands," Arthur's deep, rumbling voice vibrating with immense, quiet power. "We built walls of solid rock and beams of heavy oak. Your paper contracts and your expensive suits mean absolutely nothing against 3 feet of solid Kentucky limestone." Harrison looked at his father's permanently broken hands. He looked at his mother's unwavering, fiercely proud eyes. For the very first time in his carefully calculated, ruthlessly orchestrated life, the rich real estate developer realized he was standing in front of an immovable object that he could neither buy, nor intimidate, nor destroy. He was totally, utterly powerless. The polished facade of the successful corporate executive instantly shattered, revealing the small, pathetic, deeply ashamed coward hiding underneath the expensive wool suit. Stripped of his leverage, his false superiority, and his arrogant delusions of total control, he had absolutely no words left to speak. He turned around. He walked slowly down the heavy steel stairs, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in absolute crushing humiliation. He climbed back into the driver's seat of the massive, gleaming black vehicle. The engine started with a low, defeated rumble. The tires spun in the loose gravel, kicking up a thick cloud of dry gray dust as the vehicle rapidly accelerated toward the county highway, fleeing the towering monument of truth he could not conquer. The heavy dust slowly settled back onto the frozen earth, returning the profound, unbroken silence to the majestic stone fortress. Arthur and Eleanor stood peacefully on the high porch, watching the sky begin to turn a brilliant, burning orange, completely unaware that the heavy iron gates were about to open one final time to welcome the most beautiful, impossible gift of their entire lives.
Following the humiliating departure of their eldest son, the national television broadcast echoed across the country, sparking a massive, unprecedented wave of human generosity. Heavy canvas mailbags began arriving at the edge of the gravel driveway, overflowing with thousands of handwritten letters, folded paper checks, and quiet donations from ordinary people who saw their own silent struggles reflected in the weathered faces of the stoic carpenter and the dignified teacher. The $6 fortress was bathed in a river of financial grace. Arthur used the substantial community funds to completely renovate the remaining cell blocks. He replaced the shattered glass with high-grade, double-paned thermal windows, insulating the massive structure against the bitter winter winds. Eleanor established a comprehensive educational program for the runaway youth, utilizing her 35 years of teaching experience to transform the former guard station into a brilliant, thriving classroom filled with hundreds of donated hardcover books. Then, on a mild Tuesday afternoon, a battered blue minivan drove slowly down the 2-mile dirt road. It parked near the heavy iron doors. Out stepped their biological daughter, a woman heavily burdened by years of silent guilt for allowing her wealthy brother to cast their parents into the cold abyss of a cheap roadside motel. She carried her 2 young daughters in her arms, her face completely drenched in bitter, agonizing tears of profound regret. "I am so incredibly sorry," she wept loudly, falling against her mother's chest. Eleanor did not scold her. She did not demand an explanation, nor did she remind her daughter of the terrifying days when they had exactly $11 left to their names. She simply wrapped her arms around her weeping child, her hand gently smoothing the woman's hair, offering the absolute, unconditional forgiveness that only a mother who had survived the absolute bottom of the world could truly provide. "You are home," Eleanor whispered softly. A gentle golden twilight settled beautifully over the sprawling 2-acre property, dropping the temperature to a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Arthur and Eleanor sat side by side on a sweeping, beautiful front porch that Arthur had meticulously constructed from beautifully salvaged, thick oak timbers. The air was filled with the magnificent, joyous sounds of absolute life. Clara was singing a soft lullaby to her newborn baby. Elias and Julian were laughing loudly while throwing a heavy leather baseball back and forth across the grassy yard. The 2 young granddaughters were running wildly through the fresh green grass, completely unaware that this magnificent sanctuary had once been a terrifying tomb of despair. Resting perfectly centered on a sturdy pine table between the 2 elders was a small, polished silver frame holding a faded photograph from 1972. It showed a young, fiercely determined carpenter with unbroken hands and a beautiful, smiling teacher stepping bravely into a long, unpredictable life together. They had survived 42 years of marriage, 42 years of backbreaking labor, and the ultimate crushing betrayal of their own blood. Arthur looked out at the massive limestone walls. The heavy, rusted iron bars that had once been used to brutally lock desperate men inside a cold, unforgiving cage were completely unrecognizable. Eleanor had planted hundreds of tiny seeds in the rich soil beneath the windows. Now thick, vibrant vines of purple morning glories wrapped tightly around the cold steel, completely swallowing the heavy iron beneath a magnificent, sprawling canopy of bright, breathing flowers. The prison had vanished forever. Arthur reached across the table, his heavily scarred, crooked finger gently finding Eleanor's soft, aging hand. They sat perfectly still in the fading light, listening to the wind rustle through the thick oak leaves, surrounded by the incredible, beating heart of the family they had built entirely from broken pieces. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of a profound, timeless truth. Your true value in this world is never dictated by the pathetic price tag society slaps on your existence, but by your quiet, unbreakable ability to take the darkest, most terrifying prisons of your life and build them into a magnificent paradise.